By June of 1944, Japan's combined fleet was staking its next battle, a plan code named Operation A-Go, on something close to 500 land-based aircraft it believed were waiting in the Marianas, ready to help even a fight its carriers could not win on their own. All that spring, the aircraft factories of the Japanese home islands had run flat out to replace machines that kept disappearing from the Pacific faster than anyone in Tokyo cared to admit out loud. Workers created new torpedo bombers and shipped them south to island bases that stood on paper between the American fleet and the home islands themselves. Nobody on that factory floor tracked where any particular machine ended up once it left the yard. One man, Vice Admiral Kakuta Kakuji, held that job from a headquarters on the island of Tinian. Know how many had reached the fleet, how many could still fly, and how many were already gone. He is where this story has to start. By the time anyone else grasped what he knew, the battle that Count was meant to help win had already slipped away. For the last year of his life, Kakuta commanded Japan's first air fleet, every land-based naval aircraft strung across the Philippines and the Central Pacific. Historians who have gone back through what survives of his reporting to Tokyo tend to land on the exact same word for it: not candid. Kakuta had earned the post the ordinary way, carrier duty going back to the raids on Ceylon and Dutch Harbor, competent enough at that work to make Vice Admiral in November 1942, after 2 years commanding carrier divisions in fights that went, for the most part, Japan's way at the time. Land-based air was a different kind of command. It meant airfields spread across islands an admiral could not walk between, and it meant depending entirely on what subordinate officers chose to report and what Kakuta himself then chose to pass up the chain. In February 1944, that whole arrangement got tested for the first time, and it failed the test badly. American carriers caught Kakuta's newly arrived torpedo bomber units in the Marianas on the 22nd and 23rd of that month, planes that had barely finished the transfer south from Japan and had not yet had time to disperse or dig in. Vice Admiral Fukudome Shigeru, a colleague who wrote about the raid after the war, called the damage tantamount to total annihilation. Exactly how many machines that meant is not precise, because the unit doing the reporting had just been gutted, and gutted units file paperwork that is thin at best in the days right after. What is clear enough is that Kakuta spent the following months rebuilding a command that had, for practical purposes, already been wiped off the board once. Much of what is known now about how he ran that command comes from the kind of source that survives a losing side's paper trail. Post-war interrogations, officers who served under him talking through translators to American interviewers who were mostly trying to reconstruct a strength report nobody in Tokyo ever saw in its true form. Put together after the fact, from men who had no particular reason to protect their old commander's reputation by 1945, the picture holds together well enough to trust. None of them describe a man who was fooled by his own optimism the way a green officer might be. The picture that emerges is closer to someone who understood the arithmetic well and decided the fleet did not need to hear it yet. By June, replacements had filled the gaps enough that combined fleet headquarters counted on the Marianas garrison for that same number. The plan for the coming fight, code-named Operation A-Go, leaned on Kakuta's squadrons to strike the American carriers first, thinning them out before the Japanese carrier fleet, under Vice Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo, ever had to close the range and risk a direct exchange. It was Ozawa's own staff who had done the counting, and they believed the figure was solid. Task Force 58 did not wait for that plan to start. Beginning on the 11th of June, American carrier aircraft hit Guam, Rota, Saipan, and Tinian day after day for a solid week, grinding down the same runways and the same parked machines before the two fleets came anywhere near each other. Rows of aircraft that had survived the February raid by sheer distribution went this time. Caught on the ground in the open revetments, crews had scattered them into after that earlier lesson arrived too late to matter twice. By the time the invasion force reached Saipan on the 15th, the airfields at Guam and Rota alone had lost nearly everything based there. Hangars and fuel dumps burned down to a fraction of what they had held 2 weeks earlier. The air fleet Ozawa's entire opening move depended on had been fought down to almost nothing before Ozawa's carriers had launched a single strike of their own. None of this was hidden plainly from the men doing the flying. Pilots who made it back down knew exactly how few of their squadron mates had made it into the air with them in the first place. A base commander does not need a signals officer to tell him a runway is a smoking crater. He can count the wrecks from where he stands. Here is what nobody above him knew yet. Kakuta himself knew all of this in some detail, and what he sent up his own chain of command told a very different story. His reports to Ozawa described roughly 300 land-based aircraft still in the fight, inflicting damage on Task Force 58, severe enough to bring the two sides close to even. None of it was true, and Kakuta had far better information than anyone reading his reports in the fleet did. Ozawa had no way to check the claim from where he sat, hundreds of miles away with his own carriers approaching the Marianas, and he built his opening moves for the 19th of June around support that had already been burned out of existence a week before he committed to the fight. A man who has just been handed the number he was hoping for does not stop to ask who counted it. Ozawa did not. If a story like this, a fleet losing a battle to a report that was never true in the first place, is the kind of thing this channel exists to dig back out of the record, subscribing keeps the next one coming. On the morning of the 19th, American radar picked up Japanese aircraft heading toward Guam, and Admiral Raymond Spruance sent fighters up to meet them, treating the contact as a real threat from a base that, by any honest accounting, should have had almost nothing left to send. It sent something anyway, whatever the garrison could still put into the air, and none of it changed what happened over the water that day, where American pilots went through wave after wave of Japanese carrier planes in an engagement that earned itself a nickname before the sun went down. When the day was over, Ozawa had lost the overwhelming majority of the aircraft his carriers had launched that morning, along with 2 of his carriers to submarine torpedoes on the same day. He did not stop planning to attack even then. Ozawa took stock that evening and found something close to 150 aircraft still in hand, a fraction of what he had started the day with. And by any reasonable reading of that number, the fight was already lost. He kept going anyway, convinced there were still hundreds more sitting on Guam and Rota, ready to be called on the next time he needed them. He did not learn until well after the battle was decided that the land-based support his whole plan had counted on had stopped existing in any meaningful sense a full week before he ever gave the order to attack, let alone by the second day of it. What happened to Kakuda took a little longer to play out, and it happened close to where the lie had started. He returned to Tinian with whatever remained of his command, and when the American invasion of that island began in late July, he was the senior naval officer present, though not the man formally responsible for the ground defenses, that job belonging to an army colonel running a garrison of roughly 4,500 men. There is no surviving message in which Kakuta explains, to himself or to anyone else, the exact point where his optimistic reporting stopped being hope and became something closer to a decision. That line does not appear in any document that survived him, and it likely never existed as a single sentence anyone could have pointed to even at the time it mattered. He tried more than once to get off the island by submarine, at rendezvous points arranged in advance with the Navy he had spent a career serving. More than once the attempt failed, What survives of his last transmission is short, and it reads as flat as a man's last message tends to read once the writing is done, and there is nothing left to add to it. "I will make a charge with all forces under my command," it says. "All confidential documents have been destroyed. This may be my last communication." It was. Kakuta and his staff went to ground afterward in a cave on the eastern coast of Tinian and were never seen alive again. American forces secured the island within days. His own men buried him somewhere along that coast, in a spot nobody ever recorded for anyone to find later, and no American report and no post-war Japanese account has ever placed the exact site. What is missing from the record is not the fact of his death, which nobody disputes, but the single detail that would let anyone stand where he was laid to rest. Nobody wrote it down, or if someone did, the page never survived the rest of that summer. Within a week of the island falling, Navy construction battalions were already at work on the airstrip his own aircraft had once used, repairing the same runway his air fleet had flown from during the year it existed as a fighting force worth the name. 1,500 of them had landed with the invasion troops and gone to work before the fighting even finished clearing the island's interior. They kept building through the rest of that year and into the next, moving something close to 1,000,000 cubic yards of earth and coral by hand and by dozer, adding runway after runway to the one that had been there when they arrived. Airfield engineers laid the whole base out on a street grid, complete with named avenues that the construction crews had modeled half as a joke on the island of Manhattan. By the following spring, the same stretch of coral and cleared cane field carried 4 runways, each nearly 2 miles long, feeding hardstands built for hundreds of heavy bombers. It became by a wide margin the largest airfield anywhere on Earth, and for the last months of the war it launched bombers against the home islands in numbers that would have meant nothing to the man who had once commanded the ground beneath it, because he was no longer alive to measure them against anything. Just after midnight on the 6th of August 1945, floodlights lit that same runway as a single aircraft rolled forward and lifted off, carrying a weapon that would help end the war Kakuda's command had spent the previous summer failing to hold off. Ground crews had spent the night before loading it into the bomb bay from a pit built for that one purpose, on an island whose airstrip Kakuta himself had once commanded and had once been trusted to hold. The date fell almost 1 year to the day after his last transmission went silent. He was buried somewhere on that coast, in ground nobody ever marked. The runway he never got the chance to defend went on to outlive every man who had once flown from it on either side of that summer's fighting.